He was one black with three young white men who happened to end up with his phone, happened to end up with his keys. This does not smell right.
Hey, we're at the west tip of Horn and our bilge pump stopped working. We're going. We're sinking. Can y'all please come?
Hey, we're at the west tip of Horn and our bilge pump stopped working. We're sinking. Can y'all please come? We have a membership.
All right, of course. How far is the water coming up, sir?
A boat taking on water off a barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico. A teenage voice trying to sound calm and failing. On the other end of the line, a tow company dispatcher asking the same basic questions over and over and getting answers that don't quite land. How many people are on board? The caller doesn't really know how to answer that. Is everyone safe? Yes, everyone on this boat is fine. But the boy this story is actually about isn't on this boat. He's still on the island, and in less than 48 hours, he'll be found dead in the water just off its shore. This is still under investigation, and nothing in this video should be taken as a final account of what happened. Nolan Wells was 18 years old, a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, a recent graduate of Ocean Springs High School, a kid his coaches described as a multi-sport athlete, and his family describes simply as their son. He was 6'1", athletic, the kind of build you'd expect from someone who just started chasing a football career past high school. Friends who've spoken publicly describe him as easygoing, well-liked, the type who fit into any group without friction. On the 4th of July, he went out to Horn Island with a group of friends, the way a lot of Gulf Coast teenagers spend the holiday. Boats, sun, a barrier island 10 miles off the mainland that's only reachable by water. Horn Island isn't a place with hotels or restaurants or cell service you can count on. It's part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, mostly untouched, the kind of spot locals treat as a day trip destination, rather than anywhere to be stranded overnight. If you're watching this from anywhere near the Gulf Coast, you already know exactly the kind of day this was supposed to be. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. It's a part of the country a lot of people outside it don't picture when they hear Barrier Island. By that night, Nolan was gone. 2 days later, he was dead. And in the weeks since, a piece of audio has surfaced that doesn't answer the question everyone actually wants answered. It just adds another layer to it. Here's what the day actually looks like, as close as it can currently be reconstructed from GPS records, witness accounts, and statements from investigators. The boat left a private dock in the Ocean Springs area around 10 in the morning. It reached Horn Island a little over an hour later. From there, the day plays out the way holiday trips like this usually do. A group of friends, multiple boats, a lot of people moving between the mainland and the island over the course of the day. Nolan was one of them, part of a larger crowd that had made the same trip plenty of times before. The last confirmed sighting of him alive was around 3 in the afternoon. According to his friends, he chose to stay behind on the island. One friend has said Nolan had met a girl there and wanted to stay with her a little longer. It's a detail that sounds almost mundane, the kind of thing that happens on every group trip where not everyone leaves at the same time. Except this time, no one else left with him, and he never came back. The boat pulled away from Horn Island at 4:31 that afternoon, according to GPS data later obtained from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. Nolan was not on it. Whatever happened to him between 3 o'clock and whenever he entered the water happened while he was alone, or with people who haven't been identified publicly, on an island with no easy way off it, and no way to call for help if something went wrong. Not long after leaving the island, the boat the rest of the group was on started having engine trouble. The bilge pump, the system that clears water out of the hull, stopped working, and the boat began taking on water. One of the teenagers on board called Cito, a private towing service, not the Coast Guard, not 911. That call is the audio you just heard, and it's become one of the most talked about pieces of evidence in the entire case. It's worth sitting with what's actually in that recording, because what it shows is messier than a clean answer either way. The caller, the boat's operator, tells the dispatcher they're at the west tip of Horn Island and the boat is sinking. The dispatcher asks how much water is coming in. The teenager doesn't really know how to answer that either. "It's coming up," he says. He doesn't know how fast. They're going down, though. Then the dispatcher asks the question that ends up mattering most, in hindsight. Is everyone on board and is everyone in good health? The caller says yes, everyone's on board. Everyone's fine. At the time, that answer was almost certainly true, in the narrowest possible sense. Everyone who was supposed to be on that boat was on that boat. Nolan wasn't one of them. He'd stayed behind, by his friend's account, and the people on the sinking boat weren't lying about their own head count. But it's easy to understand why, months later, with a body recovered and a family demanding answers, that exchange plays differently than it did in the moment. A boat full of teenagers, panicking, giving vague answers about who's on board and who isn't, at the exact hour their friend was last seen alive on the island they just left. The dispatcher struggles to pin down basic facts through the whole call: membership information, head count, ages. At one point, the caller says there are no children on board and no one over 21, which doesn't really answer the question of how many people are actually there. The dispatcher ends up guessing out loud that it sounds like a boat full of minors. Roughly 7 people, based on what's said in the recording. Then something else happens, and it's arguably the strangest beat in the whole exchange. While the teenager is still on the phone trying to describe the sinking boat, the dispatcher separately reaches the boat's owner, a relative of one of the kids on board, who tells the dispatcher the group doesn't actually need help right now, and that he'll call back if anything changes. The call disconnects shortly after. According to GPS records, the boat did make it back, towed part of the way, then running under its own power again, less than an hour later, arriving back at the original dock a little before 6 that evening. So, a group of panicked teenagers reporting a sinking boat, an adult relative saying it's handled, and a boat that, one way or another, made it home. On its own, none of that proves anything about what happened to Nolan. It's confusing, disorganized, the kind of chaotic half-information you'd expect from a group of scared kids trying to explain an emergency to a stranger on the phone. But it's also the closest thing anyone has to a real-time snapshot of what that boat's occupants were dealing with in the exact window Nolan was last seen alive, and it raises a question nobody's fully answered. With all of that going on, the panic, the confusion, a boat actually taking on water. How much attention was anyone giving to the fact that one of their friends wasn't on it? In the weeks since, a handful of people who were on Horn Island that day have spoken publicly in interviews and on podcasts, trying to fill in what happened after Nolan was last seen. One friend, who says he wasn't actually on the boat that took on water, has said he spoke with Nolan earlier in the day and described him as being in good spirits. Nothing that suggested anything was wrong. That account lines up with the broader story his friends have told from the beginning, that Nolan wasn't in any distress when they last saw him, that staying behind on the island was his choice, and that no one anticipated it would be the last time they saw him alive. What's harder to pin down is everything that happened after that. With multiple boats making the same trip, and a crowd large enough that the dispatcher on the sea tow call assumed she was dealing with a small, contained group, when in reality a much bigger crowd had been on the island earlier. It's not entirely clear how many people remained on Horn Island after 3 o'clock, or who, if anyone, Nolan was with in his final hours. That's not necessarily suspicious on its own. Holiday crowds break apart and reform all day, especially on an island with no fixed meeting point. But it does mean investigators are working with a patchwork of individual accounts rather than one clean version of events. Nolan's mother, Christine Wonsley, reported him missing that night. Search efforts began almost immediately, involving the Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service, and volunteer groups combing the island and surrounding water. Wonsley took to social media directly, describing what her son was last wearing: blue swim trunks, sunglasses, and pleading for anyone with information to come forward. For nearly 2 full days, that search was the entire story. A community rallying, a mother posting updates, volunteers on boats and along the shoreline of an island most people only visit for an afternoon at a time. Then, on the morning of July 6th, a park ranger found a body in the water just off Horn Island. It took time to confirm identity. The sheriff's department said early on that dental records would be needed, but it was Nolan. His family's attorney, civil rights lawyer, Ben Crump, announced the recovery publicly before local officials did. A detail that itself says something about how quickly this case moved from a local missing person search to a nationally watched story. From the outside, the sheriff's account has been fairly consistent from the start. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter has said his department believes Nolan drowned and that investigators do not suspect foul play. That's an important detail, because it's easy for a story with this many strange, disconnected pieces, a panicked boat call, a missing phone, an undetermined autopsy, to feel like it's building toward a specific answer. As of now, the lead investigating agency has not said that. Nolan's family sees it differently, or at least sees too many open questions to accept a simple explanation. They've said publicly that things don't add up. They hired Crump within days and commissioned their own independent autopsy, separate from the state medical examiner's office. Those results came back on July 22nd, and the finding was not the clear answer anyone was hoping for. Cause and manner of death were ruled undetermined, pending further investigation. The official state autopsy results, as of the most recent information available, still haven't been made public. That gap, an independent autopsy that couldn't reach a conclusion, and a state autopsy still sitting unreleased weeks later, is one of the main reasons this case hasn't settled into a simple narrative in either direction. It doesn't confirm the family's suspicions, and it doesn't clear anything up for the sheriff's department either. It just leaves both sides waiting on the same missing piece of paper. There's another detail that's kept this story unresolved: Nolan's phone. At some point during the day, he was separated from it. His mother has said it was eventually returned to her, and Crump's team has pointed to the device's digital footprint as something they consider reliable evidence. Though what, exactly, that footprint shows hasn't been laid out in full publicly. On a normal day, a teenager losing track of his phone at a beach hangout wouldn't be worth a second thought. On this timeline, it's become one more thread investigators and the family's independent team are still pulling on. How did it get separated from him? Who had it in the meantime? And does its location history line up with anyone's account of where Nolan was and when? Then there's the footage. Crump has referenced a video circulating on social media, appearing to show some kind of argument on the island that day, with Nolan's voice reportedly audible asking for his phone back. It's unclear exactly when in the day that moment happened, or what led up to it, and it hasn't been independently placed on a full timeline yet. Investigators have specifically asked the public for original, unedited photos and video from July 4th, particularly anything showing an altercation or showing Nolan at all, which tells you a fair amount about how incomplete the visual record of that day still is more than 3 weeks later. For a case with this much public attention, that's a striking gap. Dozens of people were reportedly on and around Horn Island that afternoon, on multiple boats, and investigators are still asking strangers on the internet to send in raw footage because they don't have a complete picture. So here's where things sit right now. A sheriff's department that believes this was a drowning and says it isn't treating it as a crime. A family backed by a nationally known civil rights attorney that isn't accepting that conclusion and has commissioned its own investigation. An independent autopsy that came back inconclusive. An official autopsy that still hasn't been released. A phone that went missing and came back. A video of an argument that hasn't been fully placed in the timeline. And a boat call that, however you read it, captures a group of scared teenagers dealing with an emergency of their own in the exact hour their friend disappeared. None of those pieces on their own tell you what happened to Nolan Wells. Investigators have said the case will move to a grand jury once the sheriff's office wraps its investigation. Standard procedure locally for a death where the cause hasn't been officially determined. What that process ultimately concludes is still unknown, and there's no confirmed timeline for when it will happen. It's worth being honest about what that means. This isn't a case that's heading toward a tidy resolution anytime soon. Grand jury referrals in cases like this can take months. The official autopsy could answer the central question, or it could come back inconclusive the same way the independent one did. Every thread in this story, the phone, the video, the boat call, the timeline of who was where, is still being actively worked by more than one team at the same time. That's also part of why this case has grown so far beyond a local missing person story. It has all the elements that keep people watching and waiting for updates. A tight-knit group of teenagers with only partial answers. A grieving family that refuses to accept the simplest explanation. Official channels that move slower than public patience allows. And a piece of audio that sounds damning right up until you actually break down what it does and doesn't prove. National outlets have picked it up. True crime communities online have picked it apart line by line, and the family's decision to go public early, releasing statements, commissioning an outside autopsy, calling out what they see as inconsistencies, has kept it in front of people who would otherwise have never heard of Horn Island at all. None of that visibility changes the facts on the ground, though. It just means more people are watching the same open questions the sheriff's department, the family's legal team, and now a grand jury will eventually have to answer with something more solid than a distress call and a half-finished autopsy report. What isn't unknown is who Nolan was before any of this. A kid who played football because he loved it, who just started building a life at a community college a couple hours from home, who spent his last confirmed afternoon exactly the way 18-year-olds are supposed to spend a holiday, on a boat, on an island, with friends. His mother has described him as always willing to help, the kind of person people leaned on. His school called him a beloved teammate and friend. That's the version of Nolan Wells that existed before any of this became a case, a call, a set of GPS coordinates, and an undetermined autopsy result. It's the version his family is trying to get answers for, and it's the version worth remembering after everything else in this story is resolved or isn't. This is an active and unresolved investigation. Nothing in this video represents a final determination of how Nolan Wells died, and no one discussed here has been accused of a crime. As more official information becomes available, including results from the state's autopsy and any findings from the ongoing investigation, this story will likely continue to change. Cases like this rarely resolve on the timeline anyone watching wants them to. The next real update will most likely come from one of two places: the state's official autopsy finally being released, or the sheriff's office formally closing its investigation and sending the case to a grand jury. Either one could change the entire shape of this story, or it could leave just as many questions open as it answers now. If you want to see the rest of this case as it develops, the best thing you can do is subscribe to this channel.